Testimony bearing Exemplified, a collection containing, first, Gillespie against association with Malignants, together with the causes of God's wrath, agreed upon by the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland, met at Edinburgh, October 1651. Second, the Informatory Vindication, to which is subjoined a collection of excellent laws, or Eschol Grapes, in favours of our Covenanted Reformation, to which is added a declaration of the Assembly, July last month, 1648, concerning the present danger of religion. Also, a Seasonable Warning concerning the present imminent dangers and duties relating thereto, by the Assembly, July 27th, 1649. Jude, verse 3. Beloved, when I gave all diligence to write unto you of the common salvation, it was needful for me to write unto you and exhort you, that ye should earnestly contend for the faith which was once delivered unto the saints. Philippians 3:16. Nevertheless, whereto we have already attained, let us walk by the same rule, let us mind the same thing. In Psalm 78, verse 6, that the generation to come might know them, even the children which should be born, who should arise and declare them to their children. To the reader. It is evident to every attentive observer of the present state of affairs in the Church of Christ that true religion is very low, that the greatest part of men are minding their own things, but few the things of Jesus Christ, that we are under great spiritual judgments, although we discern them not, and that he who walketh in the midst of the golden candlesticks appears to be gone to his place, to see if we acknowledge our offenses and seek him early, and, in consequence of the withdrawing of his gracious presence from the ordinance of his grace, they are become like dry breasts and miscarrying wombs, and his people under them are so divided in judgment that one says, Lo, here is Christ, and another, Lo, there, while little of the life and power of religion is to be seen. A name to live, while spiritually dead, is too applicable to professors of all denominations. A selfish scheme of principles is likely to eat out the vitals of pure and undefiled religion, as men now generally profess to seek inward peace, their own salvation, and personal happiness in heaven, without any suitable regard to the declarative glory of God, the purity of his truths, the prosperity of his church, and to the coming of his kingdom in the world, and are much readier to love God for his benefits than for his personal excellency and glory. This must no doubt proceed from an ignorance of his nature and law, for it is plain that the ultimate end of all God's works of creation, providence, redemption, and grace is the manifestation of his own glory. And here a footnote: Proverbs 16, verse 4, Isaiah 43, verse 6, 1 Corinthians 6, verse 20, Colossians 1, verse 16, Revelation 5, verse 9, and Titus 2, verse 14. And that God is infinitely amiable and lovely in himself, and is worthy of our supreme regard on that account, exclusive of the consideration of his benefits. And his law, which is a transcript of himself, so far as he has thought proper to reveal, is spiritual, holy, just, and good, requiring nothing but what is highly reasonable, and forbidding nothing but what is truly criminal. The sum of it is, Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy strength, and with all thy mind, and thy neighbor as thyself. Here a footnote: Matthew 22, verses 37, 38, and 39. Every deviation from or violation of this law is criminal in the sight of God, and the sinner is chargeable with guilt before him on that account. This law alone is our rule, and we are bound in point of duty to give universal obedience to it, both in principle and in practice, to love all things which are agreeable to it, and to hate all things which are opposite to it, without regard to the persons who adhere to or violate the same, whether high or low, saints or sinners. As men's station in the world, or their state before God, does not alter the nature of sin and duty, nor in the least free from their obligation to obey the divine law as a rule of life. Every Christian, by consulting the Scriptures at large, which are the only sure exposition of this law, will easily see that man's chief and highest end is to glorify God in body and spirit, which are his, that God is a spirit, and is to be worshipped in spirit and in truth. Here a footnote, 1 Corinthians 6, verse 20, and John 4, verse 24. And, as a necessary consequence of this, that all false modes of worship ought to be removed out of the world, as pouring infinite contempt on him, as a spiritual lawgiver to his church. Deuteronomy 12, verse 32. The happy Reformation, to which the nations of Scotland, England, and Ireland arrived, by the good hand of God betwixt the years 1638 and 1650, has been generally considered by all true Presbyterians as the zenith of the Church's beauty under the New Testament dispensation. During that period, our land might have been called Hephzibah and Beulah, when persons of all ranks seemed to contend who should do most for the rebuilding of Zion and the vindicating of these liberties wherewith Christ had made his church and people free, until presbytery, the only form of worship appointed by Christ in his house, was established according to the pattern shown in God's holy word, and the church brought to enjoy sound doctrine, pure worship, impartial discipline, and regular government. At this time, our reformers, conscious that church and state should act in union, in promoting the glory of God and the interests of true religion, fixed our solemn covenants as the door of admission into places of power and trust, that no malignant nor disaffected person to the cause of God might be allowed to enter in to break down the carved work of God's sanctuary. And while the nation adhered to this establishment, the Lord's gracious preference seemed to be with them, and his right hand to support them. But no sooner did they give up with this constitution, that our apostasy began, and our name since may truly be called Ichabod, the glory is departed. However, it is surely the duty of the Church of God still to contend earnestly for the faith once delivered unto the saints. Jude 3. Without saying a confederacy with them, who have said a confederacy against Christ, his pure worship, and his public interest and glory in the world, i.e., such as are guilty of popish idolatry, prelatic superstition, Erastian encroachments, patronage intrusions, and sectarian confusion, who have all united in a conspiracy to rob Christ of some part of his mediatorial glory in a way derogatory to some of his offices, as prophet, priest, or king of his church. And the collection now published is intended as a vindication of the injured truths of the Redeemer against all these errors. The first piece represents the sin and danger of associating with any of the open and declared enemies of God and his righteous cause, lest we be partakers with them in their sins, and so come to be sharers with them in their plagues. It was published at a time when the pure worship of God was likely to be corrupted by admitting the enemies thereof into places of power and trust by virtue of the public resolutions, which was at the beginning of our apostasy from our covenanted establishment. And we have visibly proceeded from evil to worse, until the peculiar excellency of that establishment is scarcely known, but is even accounted religious tyranny by some professed Presbyterians. Here a footnote. See Hutcheson's dissertation, page 172 and 173. The warning and causes of God's wrath show the great regard, which our worthy ancestors had to the glory of God and the purity of his church, and how desirous they were to search out all sins in themselves and others, publicly to confess them before the Lord, and to warn others against them. And it might be of great service to us if we would impartially examine ourselves and see how many of these sins still stand as grounds of God's controversy against both ministers and people in our own day. Also, how many more we have added since that time, and have found out the different Achans in our camp. Let us destroy the accursed things from among us, and so the Lord may turn from the fierceness of his anger. Joshua 8, verses 12 and 16. And surely this exercise would be more honoring to God and advantageous to ourselves than pleading the cause of malignants, as is too commonly done. The second, that is, the Informatory Vindication, is simply a defense of the principles and practices of a few honest contenders for the prerogatives of Zion's King in their peculiar circumstances, without minister to apply to or church courts to redress their grievances, and their lives exposed to the cruelty of a barbarous soldiery, and rewards offered to base informers to discover them, which reduced them to the necessity of taking up arms in their own defense, and publishing declarations to deter their enemies from injuring them. And the declarations made after the Revolution exhibit the reasons why the old Presbyterian Covenanters could not acquiesce in the settlement then made, because they considered it as a departure from their covenanted principles, and a virtual giving up of their testimony, for which they had endured such a scene of suffering for the long space of 28 years, as that very form of religion, that is, prelacy, was then established, which to them had been a special head of suffering, and which by the solemn league and covenant, Article 2, they were bound to endeavor to extirpate, and to show to the impartial world that their principles were precisely the same with those once received by the Church of Scotland. A few of the Reformation laws are added, which will also evince that their successors, who are still seeking after the scriptural purity of these two great ordinances of God, that is, the ministry and magistracy, are following the plain and approved footsteps of the flock, and are only endeavoring in their place and station to obey the divine precept, whereto we have already attained. Let us walk by the same rule, let us mind the same thing. Philippians 3, verse 16. These pieces deserve the serious perusal of all true friends of the cause and testimony of Jesus, and the republication of them is peculiarly necessary and seasonable at this time, when not only state conspiracies are entered into with popish and prelatic malignants, but also church associations with the most notorious heretics, and with open and avowed enemies of the scriptural doctrine and government of the house of God. The established Church of Scotland affords too many melancholy instances of holding communion with gross heretics, such as Simpson and Campbell in former times, who were passed over without any adequate censure, and Doctors Darlf and McGill of late, who have published a system of Socinian principles to the world, whereby they have endeavored to overturn the peculiar doctrines of the Christian religion relating to the divinity, suffering, substitution, atonement, and intercession of Christ. And although the latter of these was staged before the Synod of Glasgow and Ayr in April last, yet he was dismissed on a mock acknowledgment, quote, that in his publications there are ideas that may appear improper and expressions unguarded and ambiguous, unquote, without causing him formally to retract his errors, call in his books, and engage to teach unsound doctrine no more, or without inflicting a judicial censure of any kind upon him by admonition, rebuke, suspension, or excommunication, an awful evidence of their unfaithfulness to God, to his church, and to the doctor himself. And it is plain that the whole ministers of the Church of Scotland, being united under the same constitution, must all necessarily be of the same communion, so that although there may be a great difference as to their doctrines, their views of church politics, or their private life and conversation, yet as they all come into office by the same unscriptural law of patronage, and sit in the same public judicatories, they are all members of the same church, and hold so close ministerial communion with one another. And the Relief Church, by their public deeds, declare it to be consistent with their principles to hold occasional communion with such as are public enemies to the scriptural order and government of the Church of Christ. For proof of this, the reader is desired to consider seriously the following extract from their own records, given by the late Mr. Boston at Falkirk, and allowed by themselves to be genuine, as it is inserted, and a kind of defense given of it by the writer of a just view of the principles of the Presbytery of Relief, a part of which is as follows.